recording. Okay, and I need to let that go. Welcome to session number 12 of Biblical Backgrounds. I'm Dr. John McMath. I'm joined here by my friends in the Philippines and in Italy. And it looks like some others here stateside. Always quite the amazing thing that we can share a time like this. It's just amazing. But anyway, today we're in Biblical Backgrounds session 12. We'll be up to the lifetime of David and maybe a little beyond that. I expect that we'll need this whole time to do background on David. The farther we get into the Old Testament period, the more archaeological bits and pieces we discover that that support the biblical narrative. As I mentioned at the beginning of this whole sequence, there are literally thousands of trivial details that that form background and evidence for the honesty and for the reality of the biblical narrative. We don't have to believe these things just on quote unquote faith, the way the world uses the term faith. We can trust the biblical narrative because it's true. It has all of the hallmarks of truth. And when the Bible talks about historical things and geographical things, even scientific things, it's telling us the truth. Because of that, when the Bible shifts over to theological idea, it's still true. Even if we can't find a particular potsherd or inscription to support the theological ideas of the Bible is still true because it has a habit of always telling us the truth. We can demonstrate that just by looking at the background. Then let's put David into context. I'm going to begin sharing the screen. Let me see if I can make it work. Ooh, it's always fun when it works. Okay, there we go. David's kingship is much better known than Saul's kingship. We really don't know how long Saul reigned, and we don't have a lot of records of what he did. We know that obviously he existed and he was obviously the first king. But David is the king of Israel who united the nation and who took it to its broadest extent of power. Solomon capitalized on that Davidic kingdom and built really quite a powerful state in the Middle East. During all of those years, during the years, frankly, from almost all of the Judges period through the Samuel and Saul and David and into Solomon, the great powers in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, and for a long time before that, of Asia Minor, the Hittites, had been ineffective. They hadn't disappeared. The people groups were still there, but they were unstable. They were fighting with one another. They were having a variety of different problems, and this went on for hundreds of years, during which time the small states, Israel, the Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, the Philistines, Syria, a larger group, Lebanon, the Phoenician states of Tyre and Sidon. These smaller entities in the neighborhood were able to take on more and more power, and we see interactions between them all. So David's rise to king is not like king of the world. He didn't rule an empire that spanned the ancient world. He ruled a nation, the nation of Israel, as a national king, a unifier of tribes. And this was a good thing. We don't really see the rise of empires, which is the next state up. The multinational empire doesn't really begin to happen until the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which is toward the end of the Old Testament period. The great powers at this time were still on the level of large nations. And we're going to see the Assyrians pop up toward the end of Solomon's lifetime. They begin getting on the radar, and they will begin to be a big problem for the divided kingdom. But at this point, 1000 BC, 1010 exactly, David didn't know anything about the Assyrians, and that was a good thing. He had plenty of trouble close to home. David came to power toward the end of Saul's reign. After the Goliath episode, we're told that David got famous. We're told that there's a song that everybody used to sing. Saul has slain his thousands and David has slain his tens of thousands, which must have been real popular on the radio stations back then. And Saul took it personally. Saul became jealous as his own popularity declined. Saul was also slightly crazy. We don't know exactly what the evil spirit from the Lord consisted of, but Saul began to behave in increasingly erratic ways, unpredictable ways. David, meanwhile, was helped out by Saul's son, Jonathan, who helped him to escape, and he made his way to Gath, one of the Philistine cities, which would have been a difficult thing. The king of Gath, a character by the name of Achish, was suspicious. So David took off, and he ended up in a cave in the Judean wilderness that had the name of Adullam. And frankly, the Judean wilderness, the hill country of Judah, made of limestone with chalk. And every place there's an outcropping, wind and weather undercut that limestone and make chalk caves. And we'll find caves literally everywhere. It's difficult to avoid them. There are some caves that are actually quite large. Big underground caverns with stalactites and stalagmites, the whole thing. We think that the cave of Adullam was not nearly so large, and yet there were a significant number of men who were able to meet their camp out in that area. This is where David began training the group that would become his mighty men, the Gibborim in Hebrew. David's mighty men were men that David welcomed into his group and then trained. He trained them to be warriors, but he also trained them to be men of godly conviction. David's training of his men is one of the most interesting characteristics of David's life. as we study through this really long narrative of David, and we're not going to go through all of it today, but as we go through the long narrative of David, it's fascinating to watch the development of his men, particularly the 30, the mighty men. Many years ago, it's hard to admit how many years ago it was, when I was in seminary, I wrote a master's thesis about David's mighty men. He started with a group of men who couldn't get along, who were running away from the sheriff, who were indebted up to their eyebrows, who needed to escape out into the wilderness. And he took that motley crew, that grubby group, and trained them to be the core of his later army. These men would be his chiefs of staff. They would be his cabinet. They would be the administrators of his later kingdom. David started out with men who didn't know which direction was downrange, and trained them to be archers and swordsmen and slingers. David came out of the David and Goliath thing as a well-known giant killer. And he went on not merely to get a group of warriors, but to train them also to be giant killers. That's one of the great sub-themes of David's life. When I'm preaching through David, which I've done a few times now, I like to make the point that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how many giants you kill. What matters is how many giant killers you train. David's lifetime is a good model for the discipling process. We need to replace ourselves many times over with others who preferably can do a better job than we can. That's the whole point. You know, I have limits, lots of limits, and I'm running up against one of the hard limits, which is the days of a man's life. You know, one of these days I'll be dead, and replacing me will be all of those whom I have trained. That's why training is the most important thing that we do as Christians. We're not training people to achieve salvation. We're training people to do an effective job of ministry to the next generation and the next after that. I enjoy seeing spiritual grandchildren out in the work, doing the work, coming along nicely. People whom I've trained, who in turn are training others and watching the work go ahead, because that's how it grows. That's how it develops. So David started off in the cave of Adullam with a motley crew. He ended up having to come in from the wilderness. He went back to Gath. The king of Gath didn't really trust him, but sent him to a place out in the middle of nowhere called Ziklag. Ziklag is probably in the Negev desert, a long way from the Mediterranean, a long way from the Wadi Gaza. I don't know what they did for water at Ziklag. It was out in the middle of nowhere. David raided the southland of Judah, land of the Amalekites and Midianites, which would have been valuable for Judah, not so much for the Philistines. along the way, King Saul chases after David. And I have to, let's see if I can get this. Yeah, the chase. Oh my goodness, what is that doing? That's not what I was wanting it to do. You know, some days you can't win for losing. All right, now I want to share the presenter view. And it's not, so I need to stop that and share. Here we go. Share this one. All right. I'm just having all kinds of fun today. Eventually, I'm going to get us to the story of. There we go. En-Gedi. This is that's a picture of me many years ago. I think Donna took that picture. This is at En-Gedi in the wilderness of the Dead Sea. As you go down the west side of the Dead Sea, you'll first come to the old Qumran community where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And one of the great characteristics of the Dead Sea area is all those caves. There are just caves everywhere. You go a little farther south, and there's a series of short rivers that come down out of the wilderness and run into the Dead Sea. One of those is at En-Gedi, comes down from a river called the Nahal David. Nahal means river, so the River David or David Creek. And it's not much of a river. If you're looking for something the size of the Amazon, you'd be hard pressed to find it here. But there is a little bit of water that comes down this creek, and we often have to walk over it walking up. This trail takes us up the David Canyon to the waterfall, to one of several waterfalls in this canyon area. And the fun for me is to visualize David and his men, who by this time had grown to 600, along with wives and children, we're told, living in this area. David was trying to get away from Saul. He spent time, was going to spend some time in Ziklag, but before that ever happened, here he is at En-Gedi. We're told that David at one time was hiding in a cave, and King Saul came in to relieve himself, and David cut off a corner of his garment. That may have happened in one of these caves, and I can't say which one. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of caves just in the En-Gedi National Park area. The place is named for the goats who live there. These are goats. The word En, E-I-N, or just E-N means a spring. So this is the spring of the goats. And wildlife of every kind comes down to the water here, at night particularly, but sometimes you'll see them during the day. These little guys, the En-Gedi goats, are very brave. They know that they're a protected species in this nature preserve, and we're not ever going to hurt them. If you even throw a rock at one of these goats, the authorities will come and get you. So they know they're protected, and there have always been lots of animals in the En-Gedi Reserve. David and his men undoubtedly used these animals for food. and they were able to get water and grow what they needed. And Gedi was a good place for them to be, and it was a good place for David to train his men. Okay, and visualizing Saul and his army, climbing up and down in their armor after a bunch of young, tough men and their families uh, climbing around in this wilderness is kind of fun. Several times I've taken groups of youngsters, college age, up into these hills. It's great fun. Very, very rugged. It's a place where having a rope would often be a really handy thing. Here's a group of high school kids heading down into a canyon. All of this territory is the territory that David functioned in. This was home for David. From some of the high spots, you get views like this one on the right. That's the Dead Sea off in the distance. Here's another shot that shows the Dead Sea off in the distance. In the near ground, this pile of rocks that you see on the lower right is actually a temple area from the early Bronze Age or before. We call it Chalcolithic because there's apparently no copper there. This was a very, very, very old temple site. And interestingly, it has a sacred area, it has a holy place, it has a holy of holies where the idols sat, the same basic architecture as Solomon's temple later. And then one last picture in this sequence. This is a friend that David might have gotten to know. This is called a hyrax, Hyrax. Sometimes the Bible calls this a coney, but it isn't. Yeah, it's an interesting little guy. These little rodents are similar to rabbits. They're very, very shy. This photograph was taken with quite a long lens from way, way off. I must have been 200 meters away from him when I took this picture because they don't like to be seen. And he was watching me from that distance with those bright little eyes and making sure that I wasn't going to get too close. I'm certain that this little hyrax had a band of brothers nearby who were keeping an eye on everything that we people were up to. And if he'd given his signal, all of the others would have disappeared into their holes, and he would have followed after them, and that would have been the end of that. David talks about the hyrax or the coney in his wilderness, running around through the rocks. That's what he was talking about. Okay. Two kings and a civil war. All right. After the death of King Saul, actually, I need to go back here. The mountain on the right-hand side of this picture is Mount Gilboa. I'm looking down from the Carmel Ridge, more or less, at about the spot where the Dothan Valley comes out to the Jezreel Valley. And off on the left-hand side of this picture will be the city of Beth Shan. And Saul and his army confronted the Philistine army as the Philistines were attempting an attack from the north, that is, across this Jezreel Valley. And Saul's men got up onto Mount Gilboa, the slopes of which are shown on the right here. The battle went against King Saul. Saul and Jonathan died on that mountain of Gilboa. Their bodies were taken and hung at Bet Shan, right across the valley. The Witch of Endor also fits in this area. The story of the witch at Endor is entirely what we expect from the practice of paganism at the time. The description of the battle is exactly what we'd expect. It would have been nice if Saul and his men had been more aggressive. They should have run down and taken defensive positions at the bottom of the hill, but apparently they weren't quick enough. At any rate, they lost that battle. And that's going to leave Saul dead and David, the king. In the early days of David's reign, as he's crowned king of Judah at Hebron, there is another king, sort of a king, at Gibeon. The northern offspring of Saul tried to pick up the kingdom. It meant that there was going to be a civil war. So Abner and Joab are the two leaders. Joab is David's guy. Abner was King Saul's man. And they knew each other well. And the battle at the pool of Gibeon is described early in 2 Kings. Abner and Joab met together as their armies were forming up. The two of them met together, and one said to the other, let's not bother having all of our guys fight this battle. It's hot and there'd be a lot of bloodshed. Why don't we each send out 10 men and they can fight with one another? And that seemed like a good idea. We call this single combat. It's the same idea as we have set out with the Battle of David and Goliath. It's an effort on the part of two military commanders to get the fight started, get some skirmishers out there, get everybody excited, and the battle would begin. But the description that's given in the Bible is striking. We're told that the 10 men for each side went out, and each man grabbed his fellow by the hair, and with his other hand, he took his sword and stabbed him. So they all fell down together. And we're told after that, and the slaughter that day was very great. The battle is going to go on. It's not ever a pretty thing. But this image is not an image that's drawn of the Battle of Gibeon. This image comes from the Hittite country, a place called Tel Halath, and dates to probably 400 years before David. This is a picture of two Hittite era warriors. And each one has grabbed the other by the hair, so neither one of them can get away. Neither one of them is armored. They're both in nothing but their kilts. And both of them are armed with swords, and we can see them stabbing one another. That's got to be a terrifying thing. I'm quite sure I would not want to do that. But the fact that this is a style of fighting that was well known and had been practiced for years tells us something about this background. Joab and Abner obviously knew that this was how it was done, and their men also obviously knew that this was how it was done. This particular Hittite relief is on display in one of the museums in Berlin. And years ago, I had the privilege of stopping in Berlin on my way home from Italy. And I spent the night in a campground so that I could spend the following day, a Sunday actually, in the museums on the island in the middle of Berlin. And when I came around a corner in this museum, and here's a bunch of Hittite reliefs, and I spotted this one. I took pictures of all of them, but I spotted this one because I'd seen it before. And to realize this is the actual thing. The relief is about 1 meter high by about half a meter wide. It's not huge, but it was designed to be hung on a wall. This would have been probably a temple. So these guys were doing something that was religiously certified. This was an act of piety to go to war in this really rather gruesome way. Okay, let's go on. So David went down to Jerusalem, and he fought against the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. The picture that we have here of this is a picture of what's called the Jebusite shaft. Jebusite shaft means, well, it's part of the water system. The water system at Jerusalem is an ongoing study. It's a fascinating thing. And the more recent part of it is called Hezekiah's Tunnel and the Pool of Siloam. And those things are very well known, and we've studied that a lot. The Jebusite shaft was the old way of, it had been cut down through the rock following a natural fault line from inside the city gate down through the stone of the hillside that the city is built on to the water level below the level of the Gihon Spring in the Kidron Valley. And this shaft is probably 200 feet, 75 meters long. It's huge and very difficult to get through. Let me show you some interior shots of this thing. We just saw that one. This is a side shaft for getting air. This looks straight down a portion of it that has a stairway. Here's one of my tour participants down at the far end of another part of it. We're told that Joab volunteered to go into the city through the water shaft. Now, that's a bit of a problem. The passage in 2 Samuel speaks of a tzinor, T-Z-I-N-N-O-R, tzinor, which might mean water shaft, or it might even mean grappling hook. It's a strange word. It only occurs there in the whole Bible, and we have some problems with it elsewhere. But when this water shaft was found, some interpreters, myself among them, made the suggestion that what Joab did was to go underwater through the pool of the spring Gihon, and he came up into the city of Jerusalem, the Jebusite fortress, through this water shaft. If he did that, that was an amazing feat of arms. He came out inside the walls at a place that was probably guarded, defeated the guard, found his way to the city gate, opened the gate, and did all of this single-handed in order to allow David's army to come in. It's really quite the amazing story. David established himself as king over all of Israel in 1003 BC. So about 1,025 years ago. Believe me, the Israelites, the modern people of Israel, know and remember well the establishment of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That's been, 3,025 years ago, long time. Okay, the Palace of David was probably established here in the City of David area. This photograph on the right shows a thing called the stepped stone structure, which most likely was a big retaining wall that prevented the collapse of the hill so that a palace could be built at the top. There are no remnants of an actual palace, but somehow we have to explain the enormous structure of this retaining wall. The photograph on the left is of some of the houses that were found in the City of David project. What is fascinating is that the people who are close to the king typically lived in this area. One of these little houses, and they don't look like little houses, they're just foundations, but in one of these rock piles was found a tiny clay impression. We call it a bulla. That reads, belonging to Baruch, the son of Neruiah. And we have a Baruch, son of Neruiah, mentioned in the Bible. He is Jeremiah's scribe, the man who did all of the writing for the book of Jeremiah. So what this means is that Jeremiah lived there. That was Jeremiah's house. This is obviously the City of David. This is obviously the core of the capital city of Jerusalem. Let me show you some more pictures from this area. That's Donna standing at the base of a big Iron Age wall that dates to approximately the time of David and Solomon. Sometimes these can be hard to date. This is that stepped stone structure from approximately the same angle, and you can see further on into the City of David project. A lot of it has been cleaned up and set apart with fences so that tourists can come and visit. Other parts have not been even touched yet. It's a very difficult place to study because there are people living right up the hill. And you can't just take their houses because you want to dig a hole. Even if they happen to be Palestinian Arabs, you can't just take their houses because you want to dig a hole. That would be wrong. But where it's been possible to purchase land and dig, Israeli archaeologists have gone right ahead. And then this is a pigeon. We all know what pigeons look like. It's in an old wall. That's a close-up of that temple structure or palace structure. These rocks are really old. They were put together at least 3,000 years ago. Okay, enough of that. That's the City of David project. And David obviously didn't mind the pomp and circumstance of high office. His palace was significantly larger and significantly more public than Saul's ever had been. As a result of this, David becomes rather a famous guy. He was quite successful in his military activities. He subdued the Philistines and he subdued the Ammonites. The Philistines were in the west, and they appear to have become mercenaries under David. The Ammonites in the east never became allies, but they stopped being a threat, and he subdued them. We know that that David had battles that went as far as the Euphrates River in the north. And at one point, he defeated the king of the town of Zobah on the Euphrates. And we're told he hamstrung the horses. Now, David probably began the habit of building chariots in Israel. Chariots, as we know, were probably invented by the Hittites. We know they were used by the Hyksos when they took Egypt. The Egyptians were using chariots when they chased the Israelites at the time of the Exodus. So this tomb painting is of an Egyptian chariot. And you can see a lot of details about this. We know actually a great deal about chariots. This photograph was taken in the Israel Armored Corps Museum near Latrun in Israel. And if you look carefully, you can see that that's the chariot is this wood and wicker work basket with very complex curves. It's very lightweight. It's just big enough for two men to stand in. The tongue of that chariot goes underneath the basket and then out between the two horses. There were, last time I looked at the research on this, I found that there are 28 different kinds of wood or similar material used in the production of a chariot. That to become a master chariot builder was a lifetime project. You didn't just go in the garage and build a chariot. Chariots were the product of master craftsmen. To build a chariot army was a job for a nation state. People didn't just go build a chariot. It was an expensive project. And like the man says, if you have to ask, you can't afford one. Chariots were expensive, like modern fighter planes. The folks in the Ukraine right now are probably wishing that they had more fighter planes. The same was true with chariots in the ancient world. And a chariot army with 700 or 800 chariots was an enormous expense. Simply training the horses, raising, breeding, training horses, keeping them fed and properly equipped was a huge job. The ancient world attributes the gathering of horses and chariots to be the work of great kings. And we're told in Deuteronomy 17:16 that the king of Israel, when there is finally a king of Israel, must not, and he repeats it, he must not multiply horses and chariots, or for that matter, wives. You don't be getting a bunch of horses. The reason for that was not that God doesn't like horses or God is opposed to having an army. He wanted the kings of Israel to trust him. The king should trust God. And on the basis of his trust in God and his obedience to God, build the army that he needs. Uh, the tendency of all politicians is to trust themselves rather than to trust God, and we see that with many of them. Okay, that's David's greatness, his fame. He turned out to be a very famous guy, but at the height of his power, David committed sin. The sin with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, is one of the sad stories of the Old Testament. And this photograph isn't really Uriah and Bathsheba at all. It's a couple of folks taking a swim in the pool of the Nahal waterfall, the Nahal David waterfall at En Gedi. But David must have known who Uriah was. Uriah was one of David's mighty men. He was one of the 30. David knew him well, and he must have known Uriah's wife. It's impossible that he didn't. For David to arrange for Uriah's death in order to steal his wife was a terrible, terrible thing. And yet, and this is one of those ironies of Scripture. Bathsheba was the mother of Solomon. Solomon is the next king in the Davidic line. So often, the Bible makes a point that the messianic line is not kept pure by holy men. The men who and the women who make up the line of Christ are not holy. God is holy. We men are sinful. God saved us, not because we are good, but because he is good. And David was a saved man, not because of his goodness, but because God chose to save him. God is good. The result of David's sin is not that he lost his salvation. That would be a wrong understanding. But he did lose the blessing of his salvation. Bathsheba's first baby died, just as the prophet Nathan predicted. Sad story. Later on, Absalom, who was the half brother of Amnon. Absalom killed Amnon. Amnon raped a daughter of David. David must have had multiple wives. We know he had at least 8, and he had numerous concubines who are unmarried roommates with privileges. It was the political marriage practice of the ancient world. Kings would marry the daughters of other kings, and that way, because you are now the father-in-law or the son-in-law of another king, you're less likely to go to war theoretically. I can't imagine that it would ever have worked, but David in particular had a home life that must have been amazingly complex. Just a terrible, terrible thing. And anyway, Absalom killed his half-brother, and off he went into exile. He returned later on and led a coup. The coup happened because Absalom was the son of David and Maacah, who is one of the wives. And he killed Amnon, who was the son of David and another woman named Ahinoam, who had in turn raped Tamar, who was the daughter of David, with one of his other wives. And in my notes, I've got in parentheses, clear? No, it's not the least bit clear. It's you can hardly imagine the mess. When David evacuated Jerusalem, he left his concubines behind. Apparently, he took his wives with him, but left the concubines behind, and we don't know how many of them. Absalom came into Jerusalem and took the concubines in the sight of all Israel. And this is a very gross thing. He went up on the roof of the palace and took some of the concubines into the closed area on the roof. We're not told what he did while he was in there, but everybody assumed. And that was the sin of Absalom. This whole practice, the practice of kings and concubines and giving in marriage to other kings, the whole thing was wrong. David did it anyway, and he endured the results of that. Absalom ended up being killed during the ensuing battle in a place called Mahanaim, the other side of the Jordan River. He was buried in a pit nearby, which is, again, a terrible thing in the ancient world, to just be buried in a pit alongside the road. Very bad. David mourned, but he went on with his reign. Another son later on rebelled. David's remaining years were marked by trouble. Okay, David is a fascinating character. A big part of what makes David fascinating is the fact that he appears to have written the Psalms. Approximately 1/2 of the Psalms are specifically attributed to David. Music would have been a fairly common thing in the court of the king, as well as in the precincts of the tabernacle and later on the temple. And this would have been true in most ancient society. It's an interesting thing to see the kind of entertainment, the kind of musical arts that were practiced in the ancient world. Often we can only guess at what the sounds were like. The ancient people understood the relationship of various sounds. They knew that strings of different tensions and lengths and thicknesses made different sound. They could tell that by experiment. And so the harp or the lyre would have been played. Flutes were known, and things, percussion instruments like drums and cymbals were very well known. And music in general was popular all over the ancient world. These particular lady singers are from the island of Crete. They belong to the Minoan Empire. The Minoans are interesting. They seem to have collapsed around 1500 BC, before Israel even came into existence as a separate nation. But they give us an idea of the background. This is on the wall of a palace in the Minoan capital. So we know that a part of the regular function of the king's court was the provision of musical entertainment. The Psalms were written at least partly in that environment. We can look at other nations in the region We've deciphered quite a bit of the Minoan language. It's called Linear B. We've deciphered Akkadian and Ugaritic and Egyptian music. We don't know how it sounded, but we do know how the words were written and how the structure worked. The Psalms are in many ways Israel's musical response to God. We talk about the praise of God. We say hallelujah is the word that means give a shout of praise to Yahweh. And when we say hallelujah, we're giving a command, praise the Lord. And to praise God is to publicly communicate who God is and what God has done. That's the praise of God. The poetry of the Psalms is unique in that in the Semitic languages, not just Hebrew, but in Ugaritic and to some extent in Akkadian, poetry was written with parallel expressions, parallel meaning rather than parallel sounds. In English and most Western languages, French I know, German I know, the poetry is written with a parallel of rhyme. The boy stood on the burning deck. Da 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 da. Okay, so you've got poetry. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Okay, what's going on there? Well, there's a rhythm and also a rhyme. In the Psalms, the rhythm is a rhythm of meaning rather than a rhythm of sound. We call this parallelism. And what makes it really unique is that it can be translated into other languages. If I can get words that have the same meaning in another language, I can translate the Psalms. So they're easily translatable into any other language, and they still have the same poetic structure. The parallel poetic structures that we find in the Psalms are also found in the Ugaritic tablets, which are hymns to Baal. Interestingly, Baal and El and Ishtar and all of the rest of them. We find this in Egyptian poetry, specifically the love poetry of the Egyptians. Psalm 29 has an enormous amount in common with a poem to the Ugaritic god Baal, the storm god. Let me read you just a little bit of Psalm 29. Yeah, it's ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name, worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Then beginning at verse 3, we see an almost exact parallel to one of the Ugaritic poems. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf and Syrian like a young wild ox. Now, the big difference is that this ascribes these massive natural forces to the God of reality. This the 29th Psalm is well aware of the parallel language to the Ugaritic. The psalmist almost certainly knew that. But instead of Baal, who is an environmentalist wacko fertility god, the God of reality is in fact the source of all of these natural forces. The difference between the created thing being worshipped at Ugarit and the creature or the creator himself being worshipped in the Psalms. And yet we see that the Psalms come out of a large traditional background. And many of the parallels that we find in the Psalms are actually found in these other cultures as well. The psalmist didn't copy them. He knew full well what he was doing. And in many cases, what the psalmist is doing is critiquing the pagans. But at any rate, David is responsible for a lot of that, whether he wrote them himself or encouraged their writing is, that's up for argument. I don't think it matters. But David is an important part of the development of the poetic literature of the Old Testament. Okay, we're going to quit there. We'll come back on Wednesday and pick up with Solomon. But I find Solomon also a fascinating and important character. Hey guys, it's good to see everybody. I'm looking around and I'm seeing Lorena, I'm seeing the Lees, I'm seeing June, I'm seeing I got another June, Don and Oscar, and there's Joyce, there's Teresita, Mark, Alexander's there, I see PJ. Okay, guys. Yeah, what fun. Hey, Brother Joel, good to see you, my friend.
Thank you,
Eduardo, Roger, hey, Willie. Good to see everybody. Christy is here. Love you all. Glad you could be there.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We'll get back to you
Thanks,
again
Doctor.
on Wednesday. And we'll pick up with King Solomon. There's a lot of background.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.